Hey everybody, in this lecture we're going to continue our discussion of Benjamin Franklin's early life. At the end of the last lecture, I was talking a lot about Benjamin Franklin's commitment to hard work and savings. He talked about all the hard work he put in to become a better writer. We talked about the vegetable diet in terms of allowing him to save more money. And I told you that these were big virtues for Benjamin Franklin. You work hard, you save money, you can achieve great things in life, Franklin believed. And after all, Franklin, as we talked about in the very first lecture on this unit, Franklin was writing his memoir with the idea that the people reading it could benefit and learn from it. He told us from the very beginning, look, I'm rich, I'm famous, I've been happy most of my life. Maybe some of the things I write about in this you can replicate, that you can also achieve. He had that in mind. I told you the way to almost think about it is Franklin was writing a self-help book that we, the reader, could benefit from, that he's holding himself up as a blueprint for us to replicate. With that in mind, I want to turn to the idea of equality and how this might relate to American character, and how Franklin might be reflecting a commitment to equality in the way he wrote the autobiography. Now look, nowhere in the autobiography does Franklin make some sort of grand pronouncement, and I believe all men are created equal. You can look for that, but you're not going to find it anywhere. However, a commitment to at least a generalized notion of equality is kind of there to be found on almost every page of the autobiography. One of the really interesting things about the autobiography is that Benjamin Franklin never mentions his involvement in the American Revolution. Just really surprising. Now, obviously, he couldn't do that in part one because it was written in 1771, before things really started getting heated with the British. But parts 2, 3, and 4 were all written after the American Revolution, and Franklin doesn't mention any of it. The closest he gets in there is, he sort of, and then there was this trouble with England, and it got resolved, and then goes on. I mean, he just so vaguely mentions it. It's almost as if he doesn't mention it at all. Which begs the question, why? Why would he not discuss the revolution? What I would argue, and by the way, I'm not the only person that's made this argument, is that if Franklin was to start talking about the revolution and his involvement and his importance and hanging out with people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, that he would suddenly take the discussion to a level that most of us readers could not expect to follow in our normal lives. At the beginning of part one, what we've dealt with so far, what's Franklin emphasizing? Hard work, saving, being disciplined. Guess what? All of us in our normal lives, we could try to be better at those things. We can try to work harder. We could try to be better with money and save more. We could try to be more disciplined in our decision making. We could all do that. All right? But if Franklin started then talking about, and then Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and I decided, suddenly we, the reader, he's lost us. Well, chances are we aren't going to get to be revolutionaries in our lives and create new nations, right? And knowing that and understanding what this writing was really about, Franklin was holding himself up as a blueprint for us to replicate, for us to copy, for us to learn from. Franklin decided, well, I'm just not going to talk about that revolutionary activity. I don't want to lose the reader. I want to keep it on their level. So he keeps it on our level. It's a rather extraordinary thing. So often autobiographers will try to sing their own praises and pump up their experience and make their life seem grander than maybe it really was. Or if it was grand, they would really highlight the grand aspects of their life. Franklin's doing quite the opposite. He could talk about his extraordinary involvement in the American Revolution, but he decides not to. He actually blunts describing his greatness and instead keeps it on our level. He tries to talk about those things that we can do. And what I would argue is that what Franklin's really saying is, I did it, you can do it too. I'm not that extraordinary. I'm not that special. A lot of the stuff I'm describing here, guess what? You could do it too. You can work hard. You can save money. You could be more disciplined in your life. And if you do, you will achieve great things. He's just afraid if he starts talking about revolutions and stuff like that, he's going to lose us. So he decides to keep it on our level. There's no explicit commitment to the idea of equality in the autobiography. But there's an implied commitment. He's telling us, I did it, you can do it too. I'm not that different from you. You could replicate most of what I'm doing here that led to my success. And stuff that we, chances are, wouldn't be able to replicate, like become a revolutionary and found a new nation, guess what? He decides not to talk about that in the autobiography. He wants to keep it on our level. It's interesting. So is there any explicit commitment to equality? No. Does it seem to be implied throughout the autobiography? Yeah, it sure does. Now, it's important to qualify here. When Franklin was imagining the type of people that could do what he did, he's thinking about white men. Right? And that's one of the reasons why throughout this class, we're not going to just read about a bunch of people with the lives like Benjamin Franklin. Our next autobiographer, Frederick Douglass, was born a slave. Right? And so no amount of hard work and saving or discipline could allow Frederick Douglass to replicate the avenues of success that Benjamin Franklin had. Not that there was not similarities between Franklin and Douglass. There was, and they were fascinating, and we will get to them later. But let's be clear, like when Franklin was thinking about what kind of people could be like him, he was thinking about people just like him, white men. Like that. All right. We'll get back to equality later on as we go. Let's talk about something else that Franklin learned from a book. All right. Around the same time that Franklin was becoming a vegetarian, he was reading something else from a book. As we talked about before, Franklin grew up a Presbyterian. Okay. But in his teens, he began to wander away from the faith. One day when he was 15 years old, he was once again, as so many of Franklin's stories begin in part one day he was reading a book. And in this book, it was written by a Christian denouncing the religious practice of deism. Deism is a religious outlook that we very much associate with the Enlightenment and the 18th century. Deism held that there is a God. There was a belief of a creator God who created the universe, created the world, created man. But then after creation, this God walks away and has no further involvement in the operation of the world. So therefore, there's no reason for church services. There's no reason for prayers to help you be more successful or cure a disease that you have. God's no longer involved with that. God is exclusively a creator. He creates the world, lets the world operate on its own, and then steps away and has no more involvement. The deists sometimes referred to God as the great clockmaker. And the reason they did that was because they believed that's kind of a correct analogy of how they thought God operated. What does a clockmaker do? Well, in the 18th century, a clockmaker made a very complicated, advanced piece of engineering. Excuse me. Creates the clock, completes the clock, winds the clock up, and lets it go all by itself. And now this complicated piece of machinery is operating on its own without the need of the clockmaker. After the clockmaker gets done creating the clock, what does he do? Well, maybe he builds another clock. Maybe he goes home. Maybe he eats a meal. Who knows? That's the way deists believed that God operated. He built a world, a universe that operates on its own according to certain natural principles, and it is done. No longer actively involved in the operation of the universe. Well, what's he doing? Who knows? Maybe he's building other universes. Maybe he's taking a nap. Maybe he's having a meal. Maybe he did it just to see what would happen, and he did it, and it's done. He doesn't know. Deists don't know. And so Franklin was actually reading a book by a Christian denouncing deism. And while denouncing, explaining what deism was. And the more Franklin read, the more Franklin's like, I don't know. This deism is making a lot of sense to me. I kind of like this. And so Franklin tells us, as he says, he became a thoroughgoing deist. He becomes a deist. All right. This is where we start to track some of Benjamin Franklin's unusual ideas about deism. Deism was never a very popular religious outlook. It just wasn't. It was very influential because, in particular, a number of the founding fathers were influenced by deistic ideas. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, the best example, but also some other founding fathers. Deism was popular among the highly educated. And so even though there weren't a lot of deists numerically in the population, it had more influence because the people that tended to be deists tended to be wealthier, more powerful, more politically connected, like many of the founding fathers. Okay. And so Franklin becomes a deist in his teenage years and convinces some of his friends to become a deist, to become deists. But after a while, he starts to notice a problem. And that was that many of his friends that became deists, Franklin tells us, kind of went off the rails, became worse people. Franklin admits also he himself became a bit of a worse person. But it's clear if you're reading that his real concern isn't so much himself. The impression I always get when I read it is he believes he could have handled deism. The problem was his friends. He convinced a number of his friends to become deists, and now they believe they live in a world where there is no longer a God judging them, offering rewards for good behavior and threatening punishment for bad behavior. And therefore, they start doing more bad stuff because there's no longer a God judging them. They become worse. They start making bad decisions. And Franklin's noticing this, going, I don't know, this is kind of problematic. So after a couple years, Franklin abandons deism. He admits this might be the way God works. He's not saying that, he tells us that although it may be true, deism wasn't useful. It's almost a direct quote, which is kind of an interesting way to talk about abandoning a religion. It may be true, but it wasn't useful. It's kind of weird. And what he means by it not being useful is it seemed to be making people worse in this world here and now. Might be true. Maybe there is a deistic God who creates the universe and then after creation walks away. The problem is if people believed that, from Franklin's experience, they seem to become worse people. And so he tells us he abandons deism after that point. But after he abandons deism, Franklin tells us that what he did after that was to really emphasize the issue of morality when it comes to religious faith. He tells us in part 1, he never questioned the existence of God. He always believed there was a God. So as unusual as Franklin's ideas were about religion, it never delved into atheism or believing there was no God. He always believed there was a God. But after deism, he says what he really started to focus on was the way in which morality can be instilled through religion. This was the basic problem with deism. Deism lacked some sort of built-in morality from Franklin's perspective. Without the idea of a judgmental God watching us, he found people became worse. He became a little worse. Some of his friends really went off the rails. So that was the fatal flaw of deism from Franklin's perspective. It had no built-in morality. And then I have a quote here from page 62 in our book. What Franklin, after abandoning deism, comes to the conclusion about was that when you basically boil down most religions, you get a similar morality. These I esteemed the essentials of every religion, and being found in all the religions we had in our country, I respected them all. He said, look, when you basically boil down most differences in religion, you still get the same morality. Don't kill. Don't steal. Don't rape. Don't lie. You boil down most religion, you get the same basic morality. And since morality was the thing that really seemed to attract Ben to religion, most religions brought you to the same morality. Okay? And so later Ben tells us that when, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about Benjamin Franklin moving from Boston to Philadelphia. But later on, when Franklin establishes himself in Philadelphia, and when he starts to accumulate some wealth, when a new church would be built in Philadelphia, Franklin said he would contribute to the church, believing that that church was going to help instill morality in people, because most religions led you to the same path. Now, did he go to that church? He tells us straight up, nah, I really didn't. Ben, as we've talked about, grew up Presbyterian. And when Ben got to Philadelphia, he must have mentioned to the Presbyterian minister there, like, hey, I grew up Presbyterian. And that minister would sometimes implore Ben to come to church. And Ben says he would. You know, the minister would see him, Benjamin Franklin, you backslider, I want to see you in church next Sunday. You get to church. And Ben, every once in a while, Ben would like, okay, all right, I'm going to go to church. Now, what Ben wanted from religion was he wanted help to become a more moral person, to become more ethical. But he says every time he went to church, he found that all that would be discussed was how to become a better Presbyterian. In other words, how to follow the specific rules of the denomination he grew up in, and not necessarily help with broader aspects of morality. I'll give you an example of something that might annoy Benjamin Franklin. When he went to his Presbyterian church, he would have been told to keep the Sabbath holy. From the Christian perspective, that means don't work on Sundays. Don't work on Sundays. But as we've talked about before, Ben loved to work. And if the other 6 days of the week Ben worked hard, he was thought to be a great person. Monday through Saturday, if Ben worked, people were like, look at that hard work in Benjamin Franklin. I like that Benjamin Franklin. Look at how hard he's working. And then yet, if he starts working on a Sunday, suddenly he's a bad guy. Suddenly he's evil. That didn't make any sense to Ben. Working on a Sunday wasn't about morality. If he suddenly works on a Sunday, does that mean he's stealing from someone or hurting someone or killing someone? No. And yet when he would go to the Presbyterian church, he would be told, keep the Sabbath holy. Ben wasn't about that. Right? What Ben wanted was nuts and bolt advice about becoming, as he says, a better citizen. And he was often disappointed when he would go to church with that. So Ben didn't really go to church. He believed in God and thought what was important about religious faith was the morality it instilled, and most religions instill the same morality. Don't steal, don't kill, don't lie. So he liked them all. Now this is where we get to an interesting idea about religious tolerance. What Franklin seems to be advocating here is a kind of religious tolerance in which you learn to accept different religious points of view. And the only way you can really, truly accept differing points of religious view is if you accept the premise that, yes, I worship this God, and my neighbor worships a different God. And by the way, I think I'm going to heaven, and I think he's going to hell. And he believes the same thing. He thinks he's going to heaven and believes I'm going to hell. But he's a great neighbor. I really like the guy. And you know what? He likes me too. We get together all the time. We talk. I borrow his lawnmower sometimes. The only way that works is if you believe that your neighbor shares the same basic morality as you do. I believe you shouldn't kill people. Guess what? He believes you shouldn't kill people. I believe you shouldn't steal from people. He believes you shouldn't steal from people. I believe you shouldn't lie. He believes you shouldn't lie. So even though we have different ideas of God and who God is and what you should do to appease that God and make that God happy, and what avenues are available for heaven or paradise or the afterlife, we share an essential faith in morality. Both of our religions instill that into us. And therefore, we're able to live together peacefully. Okay? What Franklin seems to be describing in his own personal religious beliefs is kind of belief in a secular society in which your religious views aren't held against you in society. You can go whatever school you want. You can participate in politics and voting and running for office despite what differing religious views you have. And you allow people to believe what they want religiously because you have a faith that deep down inside we share a basic morality. Right? That's the basis of a society that tolerates religious freedom. Now, if you don't believe in that most religions share a basic morality, no. My faith is the only one that truly accepts the idea of what it means to tell the truth or to live without committing others or without stealing. And these other religions, no, they don't really practice that. Those people kill. Those people lie. Those people steal. You can't live together with that person, or at least you can't live with that person comfortably or peacefully. Right? Franklin's idea about religious tolerance, because, these various religions share the same basic morality, allows for the idea of religious toleration. One of the things we associate with American character is a tolerance for religious diversity. By the way, that's not to say the Americans have always practiced this commitment to this day, but it's something the Americans claim. It's something that's supposed to be part of American character. It's something that historically was supposed to differentiate the Americans from other people, that supposedly the Americans have always been more tolerant of religious diversity than maybe people in other parts of the world. This is something we tend to associate, whether it's always been practiced perfectly or not, that we've associated with American character. And Franklin seems to be reflecting a commitment to this. By the way, I'm not saying Benjamin Franklin invented this idea of religious freedom. It just seems his beliefs coincide very neatly with the kind of attitude that you need to live in a society with religious freedom. Go ahead. You believe what you want to believe, because I'm fairly confident that your religious beliefs are going to lead you to a similar commitment to equality or to morality as me. And you could be rest assured that you can let me believe what I want to believe religiously, because it's probably going to get me very similar to a similar place in terms of your morality. So me and my neighbor, I think he's going to hell. He thinks I'm going to hell. But, I always invite him over for barbecues because he's a nice guy. That's where you need to get if you're going to live in a society with religious tolerance. Okay. Last thing, let's talk about the end of the apprenticeship for Benjamin Franklin. It happens when he's 17 years old. As we talked about before, Ben and James, his older brother, fought a lot at the printing house. And things were kind of coming to a head when Ben was 17 years old. Again, remember, Ben has problems with authority and people above him, and he no longer by this time really needs James to teach him anything else about printing. Ben understands everything he needs to excuse me, about printing. Well, a side hustle that James had at the printing house was he created a newspaper. In fact, James Franklin, Benjamin's older brother, created the first newspaper in Massachusetts. It was called the New England Courant. And it was a good side business to his printing house. It was not a newspaper that was published regularly like we would imagine, weekly or daily. The way it worked was James had all this printing equipment, and when things got slow at the shop, he would print up stories and put them into the form of a newspaper and put those newspapers up for sale. When things got slow, he printed some things up, some stories, and people would buy them. Okay. Now, one of the things that made James's newspaper popular was that James was not afraid to go after political leadership in Boston. Boston was the capital of the colony of Massachusetts. And so not only local leaders, but colonial leaders. And remember, this time we're talking about would be the 1720s. There is no United States of America yet. There is no Constitution of the United States. There is no Bill of Rights. There is no First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of speech, freedom of press. So, as James was writing critical things about leaders in Boston, he was taking a bit of a risk. Now, don't get me wrong. If you had to pick a place in the world in the 17th century to write critical things about leaders, colonial Massachusetts would have been a pretty good place because there was a lot of informal freedom of speech and freedom of press. But here's the really key thing. It was not guaranteed like it would be later on with the creation of the United States and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And sure enough, after being warned a few times to kind of watch what you say, James was eventually arrested and thrown into jail because some of the things that he was saying in his newspaper critical of local leadership. And to get out of jail, James had to commit to one of a few options. One, stop printing his newspaper, sell his newspaper, or give it away to somebody else. Well, James didn't want to do any of those things. The newspaper was a nice money maker. And so he obviously wanted to get out of jail, but he didn't want to stop printing or sell it. By the way, he really couldn't realistically sell it because he owned the printing equipment. Who else was going to, run it? Maybe he could sell it to another printer, but he didn't want to sell it to his competition. So James comes up with an idea. And the idea was, I will put the newspaper in the name of my younger brother, Benjamin. Now, James was still going to run the newspaper. And more importantly, he was still going to get the money from the newspaper. But as far as local authorities could be concerned, James could say, hey man, it's not my newspaper. It's my little brother's newspaper now. All right, so I get to leave jail. But this led to another issue. Ben, at the age of 17, was still an apprentice. And it was illegal at the time for an apprentice to own a business. See, an apprentice master would not want their apprentice being distracted with some sort of side business. They were supposed to focus exclusively on the work of the master. So James ran into a problem that legally he couldn't allow his apprentice younger brother to run the newspaper. So what James decided, which once again seemed like a clever idea, is he would release Ben from the apprenticeship, but then create a secret contract that he wouldn't show to the public, which still bound Ben and made Ben his apprentice. Right? James was pretty proud of himself. He thought, all right, I'm getting everything. I'm going to get out of jail. I'm going to keep my newspaper. I'm going to keep the money with it. Aren't I a clever boy? The problem was Benjamin was smarter than James. And when James approached Ben with the idea of, you're going to run the newspaper, not in reality, but in name. I'm going to put your name on the masthead of the newspaper, and I'm still going to get the money, and I'm going to tear up your public apprentice contract, but we're going to create a secret one, and you're going to continue working for me until the age of 21. Ben immediately understood, I'm free. I'm getting out of this apprentice contract. Now, Ben tells us that he was still committed to finish his apprenticeship with James. But he wanted things to change, and he didn't want to be disrespected by James anymore. So as long as James treated him well, he was going to continue working for James. Don't believe it for a second, please. He's getting out of this apprenticeship. Because sure enough, James gets out of jail, comes back to the printing house. Ben and James start working together. Their very first fight they have, Ben said, I quit. I'm done. I'm not your apprentice anymore. Bye-bye. Which left James in a very awkward situation. What was James going to do? Pull out the secret contract and bring it to a court of law and say, make my younger brother, my apprentice, start working for me again? He couldn't do that. Because as far as the courts were concerned, he had freed Benjamin Franklin from his apprenticeship. And if he exposed the secret contract, it would mean he was supposed to still be in jail because he was still running the newspaper. See, Ben was smarter than James. James was playing checkers and Ben was playing chess, and Ben was 3 moves ahead. And he understood when James said secret contract, Ben thought, I'm free. Because a secret contract is an oxymoron. It doesn't really work. The whole point of a contract is it's a legally binding contract which you can bring to the courts. Court system, give me remedy. Party A is not doing what they're supposed to do. Therefore, courts do something about it. But if it's a secret contract that you can't bring to a court, it's no good. Ben understood that. James did not. And so at the age of 17, Ben is now free because James just couldn't do anything about it. However, Ben's got some problems now. Okay, in fact, he's got multiple problems. Problem number 1. Immediately after Ben quits and James knows he can't really do anything about it to make Ben work for him any longer, James goes to every other printer in Boston and tells them, don't hire my little brother. He's a problem maker. He will create trouble for you in your printing house. Trust me, don't hire my younger brother. So when Ben starts to go to the other printing houses and go, hey, I'm looking for a job. I'm a very skilled printer. All the other printers are, yeah, we talked to your brother. We want no part of you. All right. That's problem number 1. Ben is a very skilled printer, but he can't find work in Boston. Problem number 2. Most of the rest of his family side with James in this dispute between the brothers. They didn't disown Ben. They don't hate Ben. But, especially if Ben's unemployed, he's going to need some help from the family, at least for a while. And they're all telling him the same thing. You got to go back and work for your brother. And when Ben would try to explain, yes, but, it was a secret contract. And they were like, no, we don't want to hear any of it. You made a commitment to your brother. You're supposed to work for him till 21 years old. Go back and work with your brother. And he wasn't having it. So the family's not super happy with him. All right, that's problem 2. Problem number 3. When James was in jail, Ben actually did run the newspaper, the New England Courant. And as much as Ben and James fought, they were still brothers. And Ben was mad his brother got thrown into jail. Some of you might recognize this dynamic. You might have a sibling or siblings that you fight like cats and dogs with. But if anybody outside of the family steps to your sibling, you and your sibling are like this, tight, right? And nobody from the outside can come between. I think that's the dynamic going on with Ben and Jim. Yeah, they were, they fought, but they were still brothers. They still loved each other. And when Boston authorities threw James in jail, Ben was mad about it. And Ben wrote many of those same critical things about local leaders that got James into trouble. So Ben got warnings also from leaders in Boston. Hey, Benjamin Franklin, do you know where your brother is? He's in jail right now. Do you know why he is in jail? Because he was saying some of the same things you are saying in that newspaper. And if you don't watch yourself, you're going to wind up in jail too. And so now Ben is on the radar of local political leaders in Boston. Not great. All right. Problem 4. Ben was still a deist at this time and was not only convincing his friends to be deists, but he was walking around the streets of Boston trying to convince people to become a deist. Boston is still run by the Puritans. Okay? There is no religious freedom in Puritan Boston. You can get into a lot of trouble trying to talk people out of their religion and convince them to be deists. And so there were people in Boston starting to accuse Benjamin Franklin of being a heretic. All right? That was a jailable offense at the time. So let's recap all of Benjamin Franklin's problems after he ended his apprenticeship with his brother. He can't find a job, at least not a job in the line of work he wants to work in. His family's upset with him. Political leaders are threatening to throw him into jail. And oh, by the way, people are starting to accuse him of being a heretic with unusual views of religion that could get him thrown into jail. The bottom line is Benjamin Franklin at the age of 17 is going to feel like he needs to go somewhere else to make a new start. He's going to have to leave Boston. And that's what we'll start talking about in our next lecture, Franklin leaving Boston and eventually winding up in the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, the city that we much more associate Benjamin Franklin with, his adopted city of Philadelphia. Okay, everybody, I'll see you next time.